Ang pinaka-epektibong paraan ng pagsupil sa isang tao ay upang makuha ang kanilang mga isipan. Ang tagumpay ng militar ay hindi kinakailangan magpahiwatig ng pananakop hanggat ang mga damdamin ng pananatili ay nananatili sa puso ng mga natalo. Walang mananalo ang ligtas. Ang paghubog ng isip ng mga tao ay ang pinakamahusay na paraan ng pagsakop. Kung gayon, ang edukasyon ay magsisilbing bilang isang sandata ng mga digmaan ng kolonyal na pananakop. Ang pang-isahang katotohanan ay lubos na pinahahalagahan ng komandante militar ng Amerikano sa Pilipinas sa panahon ng digmaang Filipino-Amerikano. Ang misedukasyon ng Pilipino ni Renato Constantino.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Tonight we're going to continue with The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. And tonight we're going to look at how Black literature, Black history, reaches beyond the borders of the U.S. into other countries. Now, in The Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson has a chapter where he talks about when the U.S. sent him, along with an army of teachers, into the Philippines to miseducate the Filipinos. And from his experience there, miseducating the Filipinos about American history, American politics, and American literature, he realized that the U.S. used those tactics to miseducate the Negro. So upon his return to the U.S., he wrote The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, from previous videos that I have done and readings that we looked at, the U.S. has a particular and a unique relationship with the Philippines. When we read the autobiography of Langston Hughes, there were various times in his early life where he talked about working with Filipinos. He actually got on a ship to replace a Filipino that was working on a ship. When we looked at George Schuyler's Uncle Sam's stepchild, he was talking about going back to Africa. He mentioned in that article that Black people preferred to look at Africa instead of the Philippines because Africa was closer. But why would he mention the Philippines if we weren't also contemplating living in the Philippines or being expatriates to the Philippines or creating a nation in the Philippines? And Captain David Fagan, another video that I've done, where the soldier went to the Philippines. A lot of Buffalo soldiers and Black soldiers were sent to the Philippines to fight the Filipino American War. And he left the U.S. Army, joined the Filipinos, and fought against the U.S. Army. They lost the war. The U.S. was looking to execute him for leaving or deserting the U.S. Army, and they never found him, and he lived out the rest of his life with a Black people called Negritos in the Philippines. So the U.S. has a unique relationship with the Philippines. And then this article that we're going to look at tonight, called The Miseducation of the Filipino, by Professor Renato Constantino, who's a historian on Filipino history. It's obvious that the miseducation of the Filipino was structured after the miseducation of the Negro. So when we're looking at this article, we're going to see how U.S. colonization and education tactics are used to colonize a people, because they practiced and perfected this method on Black people. Because once you control a person's mind, you don't have to worry about his actions. And we've talked about that in previous videos. And that's a big piece of what this article is about. But it also goes into language, nationalism, politics, and all aspects of a culture. So first, to give just a little bit of history, the Philippines was at war with Spain. And then Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. So the U.S. paid $20 million to Spain to buy the Philippines. And that was in 1898. And that ended the Spanish American War. At that point, there was a war called the Filipino American War. Now, it's not looked at as same as a war between greater nations, but this was a military fight between the Filipinos and the Americans, and it's the Filipino American War, which began in 1899 and continued until 1902. Now, the U.S. officially granted independence to the Philippines on July 4th, 1946. So the U.S. owned the Philippines for a long time. So that's just a brief history of the Philippines. So the U.S. bought the Philippines from Spain, and that started the Filipino American War. So I have a list of quotes from the article because I don't want to just sit here and read the whole article. But the article, you can get a PDF on the internet for free. It's called The Miseducation of the Filipino by Professor Renato Constantino. And this was written in 1959, which is significant because in the United States in 1959 throughout the 60s, black people were fighting for independence with the civil rights movement. So we were actively fighting for our independence, while in the Philippines, Professor Renato Constantino was talking about how the Filipinos were miseducated and under rule, through their education, they were under the rule, under the thumb of the United States. So they were fighting for the same independence mentally that black people were fighting for civil rights during the same time period, which is very interesting. But I wrote some quotes from this article. You should get the article yourself and read it because it's very interesting. And in many places in this article, you can just replace the word Filipino with Black American or African American, whatever you prefer to call yourself, and the similarity is right there. But the first quote says, "Education is a vital weapon of a people striving for economic emancipation, political independence, and cultural renaissance." I like how this article opens because he doesn't just say we want to get an education to free ourselves. He was specific, saying economic emancipation, political independence, and cultural renaissance. So when you want to protest or fight for a cause, you should be very particular in what it is that you're asking for. And that's something that we need to focus on when we talk about requesting services from our government or when we want something done for our community. We need to be specific, break it down into what we want to ask for. So, and I'm going to finish this paragraph. It says, "We are such a people. Philippine education, therefore, must produce Filipinos who are aware of their country's problems." We need to be aware of our community's problems, who understand the basic solution to these problems, and who care enough to have the courage to work and sacrifice for their country's salvation. So that's what black people need to do with our community, and that's what Carter G. Woodson talked about in The Miseducation of the Negro. Professor Renato Constantino read The Miseducation of the Negro, and he applied it to the Philippines, which Carter G. Woodson talks about in his book. Now, this is a tragic situation because the nationalist movement is crippled at the outset by a citizenry that is ignorant of our basic ills and apathetic to our national welfare. The majority of our educational leaders, however, still continue to trace their direct lineal descent to the first soldier teachers of the American Invasion Army. They seem oblivious to the fact that the educational system and philosophy of which they are proud inheritors are valid within the framework of American colonialism. The educational system introduced by the Americans had to correspond and was designed to correspond to the economic and political reality of American conquest. So this is saying that in the Philippines, the first thing that was tragic from the education that the Filipinos were getting, it made them apathetic to their nationalism, what their country needed, because they were learning things that didn't pertain to their country. They were learning things that were important to America. America brought an army of teachers, the first soldier teachers of the American invasion. So they invaded the Filipinos with these teachers, and they made sure that they taught the Filipinos things that were important for the U.S. to take advantage of that country to support American conquest. So that's how they educate. When they educated black people during segregation, when they freed the slaves, they had the Freedmen's Bureau go and educate black people. And they made sure that when they were educating black people, that they educated them to support the dominant society in the U.S., white supremacy. They trained black people and educated them to support that system. When they were in the Philippines, they educated the Filipinos so that country could use its resources and its educators and those so-called educated people there to support the U.S., not to the benefit of the Filipino. And it says, the most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. Very clear. Military victory does not necessarily signify conquest. As long as feelings of resistance remain in the hearts of the vanquished, no conqueror is secure. This is best illustrated by the occupation of the Philippines by the Japanese militarists during the Second World War. So the Japanese invaded the Philippines during the Second World War, and the Filipinos resisted, and the Japanese didn't go in with a system to educate the Filipinos to transform their minds into Japanese culture so they would support the Japanese. They just went in there, invaded, and there was continuous resistance until the U.S. went in as a friend of the Filipinos to rescue them from the Japanese. But again, once they rescued them from the Japanese, they continued with the miseducation. So it says the most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. So just by going in with your army and conquering people, they're still going to resist you. They're going to resist. But once you capture their minds and make them think like you, appreciate what you do, and admire you and admire your values and see you as superior or as a friend or as uplifting them, then you don't have to worry about their actions. And this is clearly what happened in the U.S. When the slaves were freed, the Freedmen's Bureau, educating them. But at the same time, when the slaves were free, there was an opportunity for them to go back to Africa. They had the American Colonization Society, who wanted to take free blacks, and when the blacks were free, they could go back to Africa, but they wanted to stay in the U.S. Why? When you were free, you didn't have no land. They promised you land, but they didn't give you no land. All you had was your freedom. But why did you want to stay here? Because your mind made this your home and you wanted to stay here. As Charles Burke Eliot said in his book, The Philippines, to most Americans, it seemed absurd to propose that any other language than English should be used over which their flag floated. But in the schools of India and other British dependencies and colonies, and generally in all colonies, it was and still is customary to use the vernacular in the elementary schools. And the immediate adoption of English in the Philippine schools subjected America to the charge of forcing the language of the conquerors upon a defenseless people. So, language. When the slaves were brought to America, the first thing they took away from them was their language and forced them to speak English. Because through your language, ideas are passed, stories of your history are passed, songs, culture is passed through your language. Once you take that language away from the people, you take all that history that is passed down through the language from those people. And the only history and the only literature that they're getting is in their oppressor's language. So just look at your own family. When you look at your grandparents, great-grandparents, and even further, most of what you know about your own family is from what your mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather told you. And how many songs do you know in English that touch your heart? Now imagine you, with all this knowledge that you know from your language, if your kids didn't speak that language, how are you going to sing those songs to your children if they don't speak your language? How are you going to pass that history to your children if they don't speak that language? Now in the Philippines, this still goes on today, because I talked to some Filipinos that I know, and they said when they were in school in the Philippines, in elementary school up to like 2nd or 3rd grade, they learned in their own language, but then from that point on, they taught in English. And all their classes was in English. Now you notice that that doesn't happen in the United States. All of our schools teach in English. If you want to take a language, if you want to take language or learn in a foreign language, you have to go to a special school. But our schools teach in English. And in the Philippines, their schools teach in English. Now back when this was written, and I'm not sure about now, but back when this was written, Professor Renato Constantino says that they were learning about Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, American history, things that didn't have anything to do with the Filipinos. They were learning in English, and what happened was the educated in the Philippines was distant from the countrymen and the masses of people who lived in the country. So actually the educated few were separate and looked down upon and didn't even communicate effectively with the masses of the people who lived in the Philippines. So there's a great disconnect there. And education, people with education, others look up to them. Others look up to people who are educated, and they look for guidance in many occasions. And these educated people in the Philippines were educated under the American system, supported the American ideals and American policies, which was disconnected from the masses of the people. So, the next quote. The Filipino had to be educated as a good colonial. Young minds had to be shaped to conform to American ideas. Indigenous Filipino ideals were slowly eroded in order to remove the last vestiges of resistance. Education served to attract the people to the new masters and at the same time to dilute their nationalism, which had just succeeded in overthrowing a foreign power. So, the Filipinos were fighting against the Spaniards, and there was a feeling of resistance and nationalism with the Filipinos. And then when when Spain sold the Philippines to the U.S. and the U.S. invaded, conquered them, brought in the educators, that education system slowly diluted the nationalism and the history that they have. As long as you have your history, you're proud and you want to maintain the order that you're used to. You want to maintain your country and your identity. But when you're being educated by outsiders and then you start to admire them and adopt their ideals, that resistance that you initially have, or that your people initially have, goes away. And that's what this is saying. Up to 1935, therefore, the head of the Department of Education was an American. And when a Filipino took over under the Commonwealth, a new generation of Filipino American had already been produced. There was no longer any need for American overseers in this position because a captive generation had already come of age, thinking and acting like little Americans. The stories of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln made us forget our own nationalism. So that's exactly what this is saying. So the U.S. invaded and they took over the educational system, and they kept control of the educational system until they were sure that they captured the minds of the Filipinos. So once they captured the mind of the Filipinos and didn't have to worry about their actions because they had their mind, they went ahead and let them control the educational system. And they acted like little Americans. Same thing in the black community. Once they educated black people to a certain degree, they didn't have to worry about any resistance. They didn't have to worry about any revolutions. They didn't have to worry about anything because black people became black Americans. We became Americans and they didn't have anything to worry about. The first and perhaps the master stroke in the plan to use education as an instrument of colonial policy was the decision to use English as a medium of instruction. We already talked about when you take a person's native language away from them and implement the conqueror's language, you lose all your history, you lose all your stories, all your literature, and everything that the only way you can express yourself is through the conqueror's language. And once you start doing that, you become as the conqueror is themselves. So English became the wedge that separated the Filipinos from their past and later to separate educated Filipinos from the masses of their countrymen. And we see this in the black community We saw it happen. You have the educated Negroes, which they say in books that we're reading, who acted and separated themselves from the masses. When we were going through the autobiography of Langston Hughes, he said he didn't even like to be around the educated black people because they were uppity and they looked down upon the masses, which he liked to be with, who he felt comfortable with, who he grew up with. And that's the same thing that happened here. The wedge that separated the Filipinos from their past, and later to separate educated Filipinos from the masses of their countrymen. So when you're separated from the masses of your countrymen, how can you help elevate your country into independence? You can't. To this day, which was 1959, our history still glosses over the atrocities committed by American occupation troops, such as the water cure and the reconcentration camps. So we're going to look at the water cure and the reconcentration camps in another video. But in the U.S., when we look at U.S. history in our schools, they don't tell us about the atrocities committed by the U.S. dominant society upon the minorities. They don't talk about how the Pilgrims just decimated the Native Americans. They used their English, and when the Pilgrims or when the white Americans won a battle, they called it a victory. When the Native Americans won a battle, they called it a massacre. And slavery, they don't look at the slave narratives of actual slaves to know the atrocities committed upon these slaves. They try to say that it's too graphic for young children to be listening to those types of stories. And instead of teaching it later in life, they just don't teach it at all. So in elementary school, they should start teaching our children exactly what happened with Black history. Too bad that Black history is not all fun and games and laugh and get together. Too bad that American history and American discourse has been, for the most part, negative towards African Americans and Black people. But that's our history, and we need to teach it so we grow up knowing the history. Black, white, and all the other races need to know the actual history in the U.S. to fix those problems, because as long as we keep ignoring it, the problems continue to exist until today. And we have been made to believe in certain political doctrines as absolute and the same for all peoples. An example of this belief in the freedom is the belief in the freedom of the press. Here the consensus is that we cannot nationalize the press because it would depriving the foreigners of the exercise of the freedom of the press. This may be valid for strong countries like the United States, where there is no threat of foreign domination. But certainly this is dangerous for an emergent nation like the Philippines, where foreign control has yet to be weakened. So the U.S. likes to go into other countries and say they want to set up a democracy and say everybody should be free. They want to set it up just like the U.S. But he's saying that's fine for a country like the U.S. where we have our nationalism. We have control of our own country. We're not dominated by some other country. But you can't have that for a country like the Philippines, where they don't have their nationalism. When they have freedom of the press, these dominant countries like the U.S. continue to flood them with their ideas. And then that nation itself can't rise up. It can't educate its own people the way that they want to, because they're too busy being flooded by other nations. And we go into other countries and we try to say, yeah, democracy is good for everyone. But just because it works for us doesn't mean that it works for other countries. And when the U.S. began, it wasn't a democracy. We were under the rule of England. And then when we were free from England, then we started with our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. But that was written for only white male landowners. That was not written for everyone. When they said every man should be free and equal, you were considered a man if you were or a citizen if you owned land and were a white male. Everyone else was excluded. So you try to look at it with your eyes of today, and then you're trying to say, well, everybody should be free and have a say in everything. But that's not the case in the U.S. until we rose to a certain power and became the nation that we are today. But in the beginning, it wasn't like that. Everybody wasn't free. And Frederick Douglass has a letter talking about why blacks shouldn't celebrate the 4th of July because blacks weren't free on the 4th of July, 1976. So, and it is a fallacy to think that educational goals should be the same everywhere, and that therefore what goes into the making of a well-educated American is the same as what should go into the making of the well-educated Filipino. This would be true only if the two societies were at the same political, cultural, and economic level and had the same political, cultural, and economic goals. I mean, that goes without saying. If you live in two different cultures, you're two different economic levels, and you don't even live in the same area, it doesn't make sense for you to have the exact same education system set in place. And looking at America today, and especially with the miseducation of the Negro, black and white people have always been separate economically. They've always been separate physically. And so their education goals shouldn't be the same. But like Carter G. Woodson said in The Miseducation of the Negro, the black people are going to school so they can imitate white people. They're getting the same education, they're getting the same, well, they're not really even getting the same education, but they're being fed the same information. But what works for white people in their communities didn't work for black people in our own communities and in the greater society. Because they weren't the same economically, they didn't live in the same areas, they were segregated. Today we are still, for the most part, segregated, and the goals don't necessarily have to be the same, because the outcomes are not the same. The emphasis is on universal brotherhood, on friendship for other nations, without the firm foundation of nationalism, which would give our people the feeling of pride in our own products and vigilance over our natural resources, has had very harmful results. Yeah, we have that in the black community. In everything that we read that concerns our history, we fail to support each other. We support white businesses. We support the Korean businesses, the Asian hair products. We support all kinds of other businesses. But we fail to support our businesses in our own communities. Because, and what this also says is that once it said in this article that when the Filipinos got to the point, which like black people, that when they want to stress nationalism, that they're looked upon as being sort of like racist. So in other countries and when other nationalities support each other, they're looked at as like these are strong cultural ties and admired. But once the black people do it, it's like, well, why are you trying to separate? Why are you trying to segregate? And why are you being racist? Because you support your own. The same thing happened, and he talks about that in this article, that is frowned upon in the Philippines. Other Filipinos frown upon Filipinos who just want to support Filipino businesses and want to reject outside businesses. Just like in the US, when black people want to just support their own or do something, they look like, well, why are you excluding everyone else? We need to include everyone. No, you include everyone once you're strong and once you got your stuff together and firmly in place. Then you can include others. But until then, you might just need to have your community and build your strength within your community. And here's it says, thus we complacently allow aliens to gain control of our economy. It's like we let outsiders control our community. We are even proud of those who amass wealth in our country, publishing laudatory articles about their financial successes. We love to hear foreigners call our country a paradise on earth, and we never stop to think that it is a paradise only for them, but not for the millions of our countrymen. When some of our more intellectually emancipated countrymen spearhead moves for nationalism, for nationalization of this, or that endeavor to do the majority of Filipinos support such moves? No. There's apathy because there is no nationalism in our hearts, which will spur us to protect and help our countrymen first. Worse, and this is what I said, some Filipinos will even worry about the sensibilities of the foreigners, lest they think ill of us for supposedly discriminating against them. And worst of all, many Filipinos will even oppose nationalistic legislation, either because they have become the willing servants of foreign interests, sellouts, or because in their distorted view, we Filipinos cannot progress without the help of foreign capital and foreign entrepreneurs. Filipino history must be rewritten from the point of the Filipino. And that's how I started these videos, saying that black history needs to be in our own narrative. We need to create our own narrative. And that's ultimately what he's saying right here. That was what Carter G. Woodson said in the Miseducation of the Negro and the Miseducation of the Filipino. Ultimately, Philippine history must be rewritten from the point of the Filipino. Black history must be rewritten from the viewpoint of the Black American. We can't have other people writing our narratives. So, and that's what Zora Neale Hurston said in this quote. So I really recommend that you read The Miseducation of the Filipino. I definitely recommend that you read The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. And we're not finished with The Miseducation of the Negro. I have another segment that I'm going to do concerning that book. But make a comment. Filipinos that see this video, make a comment. Let us know how the education system is currently going on in the Philippines. And I do have some Filipino subscribers because they subscribed when they saw the video of Captain David Fagan in the Filipino American War, which I recommend people to review that video. Again, this is Black Literature, Black History. Jason Williams, have a nice evening.